When the Looney Tunes characters of her childhood got knocked out, hallucinated birds always twittered about their heads. Now, as Amy began to come to, she lay still with her eyes closed and waited for the twittering to stop. She knew where she was and recalled the twisting fall, but not cracking her head on the bird bath, probably because during the event-filled fall itself she'd been so fixated on Alphonse, who had regarded her sardonically, as though Amy windmilling through the air were a daily spectacle, that she'd neglected to consider the bird bath, so that the actual impact must have been an unidentified surprise. But she remembered it now, and pictured the back of her throbbing skull as an ancient crazed vase, which, at the slightest touch, would subside into shards. The throbbing by itself might accomplish this. Not so immediate was the throbbing in her left ankle, which was actually more painful but easier to ignore, as it was so far away. As she lay still, Amy became more and more herself, except that the birds still twittered. She opened her eyes. A quartet of juncos assembled in a line on the ground in front of her face, lifted up and out of sight, apparently spooked by the flick of her eyelids. Imagine being that tiny. Sunlight pierced her skull. She squeezed her eyes shut and began to move, rising on her elbows and twisting at the waist so she could push herself up, and her right hand encountered a puddle of warm, viscous liquid where her head had lain. Amy froze, afraid to look at so much blood. For a full minute, she hovered over the puddle with her eyes clamped shut, imagining her own reflection in a scarlet pool. She had a fractured skull, or a subdermal hematoma, whatever the hell that was, and she was going to bleed out all alone in her backyard, an aging, fat woman wearing a ratty chenille bathrobe and one fuzzy slipper. Then a far-off jingle reminded her she wasn't actually alone, and, heartened, she opened her eyes. Not blood at all, but Bassett saliva. He must have stood drooling over her inert form, waiting for her to take her last, ragged breath. He was probably off gathering firewood for the hibachi, bless his heart. Tough luck, kiddo, she called, softly, to spare her head. Not this time. Amy took 1 full hour to make it back indoors. For a while, fearful of the pain in her ankle, she crawled on hands and knees. Midway, she heard the Blaines, her neighbors, in their backyard, calling their cats and sprinkling their camellias. She opened her mouth to shout to them, and then stopped. They were nice people. She fed the cats when they visited their grandchildren, and they'd be anxious to help. But Amy got stuck, as she so often did, on what words she would actually use. When she was 18 years old, she had almost drowned in the Kennebec River, not because of the pummeling current, but because she couldn't come up with a casual phrase with which to call for rescue. Help was such a cliché. By the time she was willing to scream, she had no breath left, and it was just blind luck that somebody saw her gasping and floundering and pulled her to shore. "Why didn't you say something?" they wanted to know, and she said, "I'm not a screamer." "Jesus," said one of them, "couldn't you have made an exception this one time?" "Apparently not," she said. Now she began to rehearse. "Hi there. Hello, Blaines. Say, I'm terribly sorry, but have you got a minute?" What then? The Blaines were short, small-boned people. Between them, they couldn't possibly pull her to her feet, and she'd feel funny about leaning on them, or, indeed, on anyone else. In the end, she kept her mouth shut and just sat up on the cement and listened to them argue about a misplaced coupon in the penny saver and whether they should feed their mandarins now or in February. Above her head, the goldfinches returned to their feeder, having decided she couldn't rise up and bother them. Her head, she realized, had stopped throbbing, and she felt suddenly optimistic. Gingerly, she probed the back of her skull, which didn't feel particularly mushy. In fact, it was beginning to numb up. Her ankle was swollen.